Like economics, you can have better economic structures and ones that are not as good because they don't reflect human condition and so forth. But in the midst of it, the key is the economic actors, the virtue of the economic actors. And that's true in a local church context. All parties, for that governance, that mission to flourish, all stakeholders to flourish, I'll use that word, there has to be the cultivation, we'll use different language here, of spiritual formation, virtue formation, and character. In fact, when you look at how Paul helps frame the early church to the early leaders, when you look at the list in Titus 1, or 1 Timothy 3, the vast majority of his guidance for selection is all character and virtue. Now, that's not to say competence doesn't matter, but the emphasis is on the character of the players in the structure.
Welcome to the theFormed.life podcast, where we aim to help you follow Jesus in all of life. I'm Paul, and I serve as the campus pastor at our Shawnee campus.
And I'm Bill, and I serve as the campus pastor at our Brookside campus.
Yeah, and on this episode, we're discussing something that, when it's healthy and working well, we hardly ever think about: church governance. But what makes for healthy church governance? What wisdom do the scriptures offer us? And how can we apply that, not only in the local church, but also in our leadership contexts, wherever our Monday lives take us?
Yeah. You know, in this episode, I got to sit down with our lead senior pastor, Tom Nelson, as well as our elder chairman, Kevin Rauckman. Kevin is the owner of Rauckman Advisors, LLC, and from 1999 to 2014, Kevin served as the chief financial officer and treasurer for Garmin. He was named CFO of the Year by the Kansas City Business Journal in 2008, and he just has a ton of experience around governance, both in the nonprofit world, like a place like Christ Community, as well as in the for-profit business world. It was a great conversation, so let's go ahead and jump in right now. Tom, Kevin, thanks so much for taking the time to have this really important conversation about church governance, particularly today, but just organizational governance and leadership of organizations of all sizes, shapes, and types. And I just want to begin by asking the question to both of you: why does this conversation matter so much, and what is at stake in the midst of it? I mean, Tom and Kevin, you have both had lots of experience with a variety of types of organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, local churches, in various leadership roles, whether that's like being on the board or being an executive that's reporting to that board. And so I just would love to hear from you. Why does governance matter? And maybe even just quickly too, when we use that language of governance, kind of what are we talking about in that? So yeah, how would you guys respond to that?
Well, I would maybe jump in first, if that's okay. Technically, in organizational language, governance is often distinguished between management.
Okay.
So depending on how we frame that from an organizational standpoint, but let's just say overall governance or leadership from an organization, I think its importance is centered in the very character of God. Because we see God, the triune God, as a God of governance. I mean, he governs his universe. We image him, and part of that image bearing, this early in Genesis, the cultural mandate, and that is to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and have dominion. Not domination, but dominion. So we are entrusted an order of leadership in creation, in joining God in his work in the world, in his mission in the world. So I think when we start talking about that, we have to center it in God himself and God's design. And how that works its way out, we're going to have some more conversation about that. But it is centered in God's character, the design of the world, and how he is bringing his purposes into the world.
Yeah. Well, and Kevin, you currently are serving as the elder chairman here at Christ Community. In your career in the corporate world, and you were also serving on other boards, but I mean, you've seen a lot of this, and I'm just wondering, you've probably seen lots of examples where governance has gone really well, maybe somewhere it hasn't, and just what makes the difference and sort of what's at stake in this?
It's a really good question. I think, from my perspective, it's aligned with Tom, but if you think about governance, it's really an organization is well led. There's direction, there's control, although I don't really like that word, but there is some oversight. And if you don't have that, so maybe starting with bad governance would say, the one that comes to mind and often is brought up in the media would be Enron. Right? Enron is an organization. Not good governance. The board wasn't paying attention. The executives were being deceitful. They weren't managing well, and we all know what happened to that organization. So The reason it's so important in any organization, whether it's a church, a nonprofit, or a for-profit, is structure and organization matter. And to Tom's point, God's designed the world a certain way, and we need to, I think, have some sort of direction in that regard. So,
yeah, I think that's really good. And God's design is to bring order out of chaos, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so that is part of bringing order to purpose and guidance. And I just think that's another part of the very character of God, why that's essential to God's design.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's really good. Just this. Yeah. Do you want to add something there,
No,
Kevin?
just go ahead.
Yeah. This is really good. So when we think about what's at stake, so there's a lot at stake. I mean, I love that example of Enron where it goes poorly. The implications of that, not just in that case for maybe the employees, the shareholders, but the impact that could have on the broader economy. When you think about that for a local church, people who are given to that church, who are looking to that church for care and preparation for their Monday lives. I mean, there's just a lot at stake when we think about how do we set up an organization with good checks and balances, with good, like you said, just oversight and accountability, because we're all fallen as well. And so we need that. And even outside of that context, it's just part of God's design for this. So again, lots at stake here. And thankfully, the scriptures do give us some insight. We rooted this in the character of God on how to think about this. And they give us wisdom. They give us principles for navigating this. But sometimes applying that wisdom can be more complicated than we might think. And sometimes it's easy to turn to a passage maybe in 1 Timothy or Titus, and you see a list of kind of requirements for the office of elder and those kinds of things and think, well, here we go. We just need to apply this. But I want to read a quote. It's a little extended passage from Tim Mackie. Some of you may be familiar with Tim Mackie. He's part of the Bible Project. And they had a conversation recently that touched on this. And I think Tim provides some interesting insight on some of the complexity of providing, of moving from the world of the biblical text to our current settings. This is what Tim says. So he says, in the social environment of the earliest generation of Jesus followers that gave us the New Testament, the apostles, they already were living as Messianic Jews, as a religious and cultural minority in a dominant culture of the Roman Empire. So already he's setting the kind of the context there. And Tim points out they gathered in homes that limited the amount of people that could be a part of one little mini institution, right? So that there's a certain context that we're looking at there. So you're really limited in what kind of institution could even be imagined, Tim points out, in that moment. So he says then it takes a couple of 100 years before you get to the later generation of leaders in the post-New Testament era, having to tackle these problems of institutional structure with the rise of bishops over regions, of churches and communities. So this is what I thought was just so helpful. He says, and the apostles just didn't even ever have to speak to that. It was just a small movement, right?
Exactly.
And neither did Jesus, because it wasn't their social reality. So it's a question that most Christians now, for most of church history, have had to wrestle with, but that the apostles just didn't deal with. And so they give us an ethical vision, they give us principles, they give us wisdom, and we can extrapolate from there. But it's not necessarily just a copy and paste from the pastoral epistles into your modern 21st century church leadership structure. So Tom, can you just respond to that? And what do you think about that? And from those insights.
I like Tim's insight there. I think this is really important because not only is sort of the cultural context of a house church with maybe 20, 30 people, right? That Paul is writing, for example, to Timothy, who's at Ephesus, a very small context. What Paul does do, though, even though it's a simple structure, he is embedded in a wisdom tradition that precedes him. So he is assuming that already, and that's where we can really gather the timeless wisdom in common grace. Let me just go back to the Old Testament example. The principle of wisdom, and there's a lot of it in the Old Testament on leadership and governance. One of the most classic ones, right, is Exodus 18. Because you think about the children of Israel leave a whole culture, they're sent out into the wilderness. There's a lot of them.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
And Moses is the lead dude, right? I mean, so his father-in-law, we tend to think about mother-in-laws and father-in-laws, are a problem. Thank God for Jethro. Think where God's purposes would be. And we don't even know if he was a God worshiper. I mean, it looks like he becomes that. But he pulls Moses aside, right, in common grace and wisdom. And Moses is trying to lead the whole thing. Everybody's coming to him. It's chaos. He's exhausted. And basically, what I love about it is Jethro says, and he just gets in his face, like, hey, Moses, Like, I know you were training all the Egyptian, you're really smart and all that, but you got this one wrong. And, you're doing this all wrong.
Yeah.
You're going to wear yourself out. It's very common grace wisdom about leading. He says you got to delegate. You got to develop and delegate people because of the size and scope. Well, Paul understood that. I mean, that was part of the whole Torah and the history of wisdom. And I think that just reminds us that when we think about governance, as it relates to the social context, the structure, the complexity, the size, God's word has given us some principles that are timeless in common grace and common good.
Yeah, and I think principles is a good way to think of it, because not in any organization or any institution, the facts look a little different. You can say, well, all churches are the same. No, they're not. I mean, even think about Christ Community when we started.
Yeah.
34 years ago, 35 years ago, it was essentially a house church.
It was a house church. Well, literally an apartment.
We're not a house church anymore. In case anybody hadn't noticed. So I think those principles can really be applied in whether it's an Old Testament, looking at Old Testament with Jethro and Moses, or looking at a house church, or looking at a church the size of ours right now. So, I think it is extremely important. And, it's just been fun to watch our church even change over time. Yeah.
Yeah, and on that, just on the same sense of the development, even think of the book of Acts. I'm just saying how the apostles understood this from the Old Testament and from common grace and wisdom. As the early church, all of a sudden, boom, there are all these people, and what are they going to do? They delegate and divide.
That's right.
They divide, delegate, and empower and hold them accountable, but they empower a group of leaders to focus on the widows and caring for the needs. So there is this principle all the way through. I just want to say that I think we have to understand that's the most important part as we think about there's no perfect structure, no perfect people, but that there's a dynamic development based on size and complexity. It's a sociological dynamic that is not unspiritual. It's just the way how God's designed the world.
Yeah, Tom, I want to pick up on something you said there, because you named, no perfect structure, no perfect people. We certainly acknowledge Christ Community is not the perfect church. But we were talking earlier, even though there are no perfect people, character and virtue of the people in that organization, in particular in the leadership who have been entrusted with that leadership, whether they are on the board side of that, whether they're on the more the management side of that as staff, as well as the congregation as a whole, that virtue, character really matters. So speak about that, because there are lots of different forms of church government, different styles of that. But what about that character virtue part?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear Kevin on that too. It's like, we do know throughout church history and present that there are different, we call them ecclesial structures, or structures of churches that, appeal to certain scriptural texts for validation.
Yeah.
And I think that's good. It shows there's not just one size fits all. I mean, I think there's diversity there that's really good. Each one has its strengths and maybe weaknesses, right? That's just the nature of an imperfect world and imperfect structure. But it's like the economy, right? Like economics, you can have better economic structures and ones that are not as good because they don't reflect human condition and so forth. But in the midst of it, the key is the economic actors, the virtue of the economic actors. And that's true in a local church context. All parties, for that governance, that mission to flourish, all stakeholders to flourish, I'll use that word, there has to be the cultivation, we'll use different language here, of spiritual formation, virtue formation, and character. In fact, when you look at how Paul helps frame the early church to the early leaders, when you look at the list in Titus 1, or 1 Timothy 3, the vast majority of his guidance for selection is all character and virtue. Now, that's not to say competence doesn't matter, but the emphasis is on the character of the players in the structure.
Yes, I think on a governance structure, the assumption is the players, whether you're an elder team or a senior lead pastor or whatever the title is, there's transparency, there's fairness, there's love, there's all these character pieces. You're hospitable, you're not a drunkard, all these things that you bring up in Titus or in 1 Timothy. But the assumption is people are going to treat others fairly. They are going to represent the stakeholders, the shareholders, whatever organization we're talking about. And if there is a challenge, there is a problem along the way, the structure or the governance helps combat that. So that's why this is so important in the life of any institution.
Yeah, Kevin, I'd like to pick up on that because you, in this stage of your life and career, you serve on a number of different boards. You don't just serve here on the board at Christ Community, but of other institutions. And so, being that they are not local churches, they probably don't have 1 Timothy 3 explicitly as part of their board member selection process. But I'm just curious how you've seen some of those characteristics play into those boards you've been a part of.
Absolutely. And, my background is in the financial world. So, in the financial world, we've seen a lot of organizations, whether they're private organizations, public organizations, even nonprofits to a certain extent. If the financial piece is broken, then there's big problems, right? So this is where you often see it in a board, is that you assume that the players, that the elder or the board itself or the executive team management are going to be operating as they should, with integrity. And it's interesting, while there's differences between a church and let's say a corporation, let's say a publicly traded organization, the mission and the vision and the values of those organizations are often very similar. I mean, the mission of Christ Community versus the mission of a for-profit entity, there's a lot of common ground there. You're not going to set yourself up with a mission that's going to be against your shareholders or doing something that's illegal or really problematic to the communities that we serve in. So there is, I feel like while there's differences, there's a lot of similarities too.
It's really helpful because I think a lot of our folks, even listening to this, are in, whether it's a small entrepreneurial startup or maybe involved in leading in other kind of contexts. There's a lot we can glean here for our Monday lives, wherever we find ourselves. Yeah,
and I think Kevin has a lot of experience in a wider range than I do, but I think there's incredible overlap on principles of good structures or not good structures.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's very true, understanding human nature, both the need for incentive, but also a sense of recognize we can really, we're broken. We can really screw up, right? I mean, if I may use that language. But we can really mess up, is a better word. But I think there's certain principles that are transferable here that are very important in church and outside it. And one is the idea that there's checks and balances. That's one of the good things that our nation and more of a democratic understanding versus a monarchy has brought to the world, that any stakeholder can abuse power. That power, all of us individually have power. It's the very definition of a spirit, right? Spirit is unembodied personal power. But then how do we navigate that for the common good and have checks and balances on our proclivities to abuse power or pride? So there are checks and balances, clear boundaries of the players. And then I think some other key principles are really important in any kind of governance. One is the sense of empowerment and accountability. Both of those are important. In any organization, each player has to have empowerment, right? And the key there is responsibility and authority have to be commensurate. Like if you give, and we've all been in those situations where we've been asked to do something, we don't have the power to do it. It's terribly frustrating. So there's certain principles that are timeless across organizations and are a vital part of Christ Community structure and intentionality.
Yeah, it's really good. Well, so you guys, we've talked a little bit about, why does this matter so much? That's where we began. We've been talking about what are some of those basic biblical principles or the Old Testament wisdom, what we see in Acts and the pastoral epistles where Paul and the other apostles are giving some guidance to this emerging Jesus movement and what is this going to look like. But as we looked at in that quote from Tim Mackie, obviously this has become a global movement, a complexity of kind of styles and sizes of churches that certainly I don't think the Apostle Paul would have imagined, certainly didn't have to address in his letters. And so I'm just then curious, so we've talked a little about why and what, but how have we at Christ Community looked at those timeless principles from Scripture and applied them to this moment in the life of Christ Community? Even that looks a little different than we applied it 34 years ago in some ways. But I'm just curious, what are some of the key factors? We have maybe we can talk a little bit about this. We have a congregational form of church government. So that right there kind of sets some boundaries and parameters as part of our connection to the evangelical free church movement. We're a congregational form of government. So then within that kind of that frame, how have we applied these principles?
Yeah, and I'd love to hear Kevin more on the current, but since I'm the older guy and had the joy of helping be the architecture of our structure, that's just part of when you church plant, that's part of your role.
Yeah.
Let me frame at least our intentionality and the goodness. It's not perfect, right? But the goodness of our structure, one of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to be accountable outside the local level. So one of the most important things, if I'm a congregational member or a staff member or a board elder chairman, is to understand that we are not a church that's an isolated island. Mm-hmm. From the very beginning, we've been a part of a national movement where we are accountable to the national denomination around doctrine, right, and ordination of our clergy. And again, this is really another level of accountability that's really important, and some churches don't have that. So it doesn't guarantee that we won't mess up, but there's another layer of confidence we have, of another layer of accountability we have wanted from the very beginning. Having said that, congregationalism simply is not about a democracy. It's not about everybody having a vote. And that's what I'm saying. We need to understand we want everyone's voice or gather voices, but not everyone has a vote. Mm-hmm. But there are three things that are really important to understand, that in our structure and history, it goes back to Europe, that we talk about stakeholders. There's really three stakeholders at Christ Community in this sense of a variation. And all three have an important role and boundaries and checks and balances. Mm-hmm. So congregationalism, the goodness of it, is that the congregation has a role, but checks and balances on it. That's why we have bylaws. The board that governs the church has responsibilities and accountabilities to the congregation, right? So there are checks and balances on the board. That's why we've been going through all these bylaws to keep those principles intact. And then clergy. Clergy have accountability, right? Like, for example, in our structure, the senior pastor cannot be the chairman of the elders. And there's reasons why that.
Yeah.
Why that's that. So I'm saying those checks and balances don't guarantee virtue, but they encourage checks and balances. And we have maintained that all the way through. And moving forward to the future, and our new bylaw revisions really affirm that. It just recognizes the complexity of it. So congregationalism isn't perfect, but it's really, really good on that part of check and balance on power, boundaries, accountability, and order. And again, that's one of the reasons why we chose it and why we think it's a really good structure.
Yeah.
And a couple other things maybe aligned with that. I'm sure our listeners, if they're listening, they know we just went through the bylaw revisions. So not only just the chairperson and the lead senior pastor, the three of us sitting at this table are never the same person. If you look at an outside organization that's also not a church but a corporation, you often see the same thing. It's not always the case, and the reason is, again, this is balance of power.
Yeah.
And so, like, the elder team has authority as a we oversee the ministries of the church from the congregational perspective, but there's still the clergy and the pastors that have a lot of responsibility. So from the role of the elder team, we oversee the lead senior pastor primarily, secondarily the executive pastors, and then even down the road would be the campus pastors. But the campus pastors have ultimately they have direct reporting up into the senior pastor team.
Mm-hmm,
so.
Mm-hmm.
A couple other things around governance. I don't know if you were going to go there. I'm just going to jump right in. We can come back to it. Is that from a governance standpoint, our elders are nominated periodically, and they're in a staggered period. So right now we have nine elders. At any given time, we're going to have one or two or three new elders a year, but we're not in a board that's perpetual. They move, and so. For example, if there was one bad actor in that group, they're eventually going to be off the board after 4 years. So, again, this is also common in many other like public companies and nonprofits. Sometimes you'll get a board and they'll be there forever. That's not good governance because of this whole area of accountability and balance of power. So we're structured that way, where we have ongoing changeover, and actually from an overall governance, the congregation is the one that actually votes on that. So it's not that the elder team is going to set up themselves and they're going to vote for themselves. It's actually got to be approved by the congregation. Yet another good governance structure.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because not all church structures have that.
Yeah.
So many church structures, and I'm not saying they're all bad or good, but have a perpetual elder board. Mm-hmm. I mean, literally they can be, and we have term limits. Mm-hmm. And we think that's good for developing new leaders, but also that check and balance. All three of those stakeholders can further the mission with unity and love and good boundaries, or they can block it, right? And that's the idea. Mm-hmm. A congregational member, under certain contexts, can actually hinder the mission. They can step out of line. A clergy can do that, or a board member can do that. And we're trying to guard against that. At the same time, thinking the most positive, filling those spaces with trust and not suspicion, but encouraging that kind of accountability and empowerment and boundaries and good line reporting. So people know exactly who they report to, and there's clarity in that organization.
Yeah, I think another really important piece that I really appreciate and how we're set up too is not only is the lead senior pastor and the elder chairman a different person, but also the lead senior pastor doesn't select the chairperson, that person who leads the team.
Thank you. That's very important.
Because that can also be sort of could seemingly hide power there, where it's like, well, really, the lead senior pastor is just always picking, his best buddy and his yes man to be in that role. In our structure, the outgoing chairman selects the next chairman, and so that's another level. Even if I've talked with people who have come from different contexts where there's been sort of maybe abuse of power or some questions. This is another piece of structure that we have in place. I wonder, Kevin, can you talk a little bit about just even how we select elders?
Sure.
And we've talked, they serve for 4-year terms. The lead senior pastor, who is also an elder, that's the only staff person who is an elder, is that person.
That's another part of our structure. So,
So that person is the only perpetual elder, if you will, but the rest of them are always rolling over after those 4-year terms. But how do we go about finding those people to serve on that team, and what does that look like?
So it is. I would say it is a somewhat of a collaborative effort. Actually, it's not one person picking their friends and saying, "Hey, you got to come onto the elder team with us." It's we do a combination of we go to the campus pastors and say, okay, who are either the ongoing leaders who have either served in the past or could serve on the elder team for the first time, and we have those names kind of bubble up and say, yeah, these 2 or 3 people from each of our campuses could be an elder. Okay, so then we also have an elder team that puts together basically a nominating committee, and it's made up of 50% elders and 50% non-elders. So again, we're pulling the congregation into that process. So not only do we ask campus pastors, we have the congregation involved, we have the elders involved, and then they go out and do some interviews and have conversations with the possible elders, and they report back and say, we think for this next year, Elder 1 or Elder 2 would be the best nominees. And then those are the ones that get brought to the congregation for the vote, like at the annual meeting we just had a few weeks ago. So I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but that's pretty
really
much
helpful,
our process.
Kevin. Yeah, and another thing to note too, in that while in our kind of form of understanding this complementary alliance and male and female together in church leadership, and we do have all male elders, but on that nominating committee, that group of 50% elders and the congregation members, we also include women on those teams. And then you have women who are voting for these elders as well in the congregation. Yeah.
So this last year we had 2 elders that were working on the so-called subcommittee, and then 2 females that are from the congregation. So it was a 50-50, but the point is that the congregation representatives were both women.
Yeah, and we just think that's really important and as we understand God's design in the midst of all that. And we even put some links in the show notes back to some episodes where we talked a little bit about that in our paper and our position on that. So anything else you guys just want to add on how we're currently structured? Maybe even, actually we're recording this on a Thursday. Elder meetings typically happen on a Thursday. What for someone who's just curious, what happens in an elder meeting? What's a typical elder? I didn't prepare you guys for that question.
I'll just jump in. Kevin leads this, and Kevin is a wonderful elder chair. We've had remarkable elder chairs over the years, and Kevin's certainly on the top there. But this morning, Kevin led us, and we usually there's a certain, if we may be a bit dichotomous, we have some business items we need to cover from oversight issues or policy or decisions. But we usually have what we call a sharpening time, and that can be going through a book, broad range of books. But this morning, Kevin led us in a devotional in 1 Peter chapter 5. Yeah. I've got to think that. And it was all about the role of the oversight board or leaders in terms of their character. And the themes were suffering and humility and guarding against pride and the evil one. So it was a really rich discussion, and then a time of extended prayer for each other's lives, for people's lives, and for God's blessing, favor, protection, provision, which is a constant trust we have of finances and people. So it was a really rich morning, but it's an example this morning. So you can go,
so
it was a really good morning.
In addition to those times, those are kind of the consistency. And then we get into, the fun stuff, right? We're actually dealing with matters of the church, whether it's whether it's different parts of the ministries, we looking at discipleship or potentially, campuses. We almost always have an update from a campus. So this morning we had Jonathan Neef come in and give us an update on the Olathe campus. And we also will have some of the multi-site leaders as well, whether it's Dela coming in talking about financial piece or whatever. So it's a combination of updates from across the different ministry groups and also across the campuses. And then there's always some sort of decisions that need to be made too. So there's some advisory that we're giving to the pastoral team, but also having to make certain decisions that come up throughout the year.
Yeah. And budgeting is a big part of that process every
Absolutely.
year, decisions to be made and those kinds of things.
The elders really focus on this. Like there's many things, but the broad framing is theological oversight, guarding doctrinal drift. That's the negative side, but the positive is nourishing a good theological integrity. Financial integrity is huge. Oversight, the elders have access to everything if they want, right? So, and missional direction and guarding against missional drift. So these are some of the main pieces that they are, as a board, are watching, and again, obviously planning and doing policy and looking ahead and that kind of thing. But just kind of some of the focal points.
And I would say one other thing that many people probably have a misunderstanding of or don't understand because they haven't been on a board. If you've been on a board, you understand. But if you haven't, like an elder does not do all the detail of the church. And we talked a little bit about this during our bylaws. Whether I'm on a board of a publicly traded company or a nonprofit or a church, the board members typically are not doing the management of that organization. They rely on the staff, the pastors. And so what that entails from a governance standpoint is those who are actually doing the day-to-day work have to be transparent to the leaders, the elder team, for example, on here's what's going on. That's why we get a campus update consistently. We want to know what's going on in Shawnee and Leawood and Olathe, and then any other things that are going on so that we can not only put those to prayer, but also have the information that we need to make wise decisions and advise the pastoral team. So just wanted, while we have an opportunity, at least explain what's included as an elder, but also what's not included.
Yeah, that's really important. That's really important. Well, you guys, this has been so helpful. I think our listeners will find it really helpful. And certainly, if you're listening to this and you have more questions, there's more we could have covered here, you can certainly reach out to your campus pastor, and they'd be able to kind of point you in the right direction on more details there. If you do have additional questions, and we cover a lot of this in membership class. So if you're not a member and you're thinking about that, and you sign up for a membership dinner, we're going to talk a lot about that because this stuff really does matter deeply for the flourishing of a particular local church and more broadly for the mission of the church globally. And so as we wrap up this time, Kevin and I always like to ask our guests a question. Tom's been on before, so I've asked him this question, but I wanted to get from you just a kind of a get to know you question. You've spent this amazing career in corporate kind of finance work, and now you're serving on these boards. But if you could do, just live, Kevin Rauckman gets a second life, and you get to do something totally different with your career path. Is there something out there that's like, I'd love to do that? I'd love to be a park ranger.
This is a tough question.
Yeah.
Bill. You know how hard this is. By the way, what was Tom's answer? I don't even know what Tom's answer was.
It'd either be like, a forest ranger, a park ranger, game biologist. It's all about nature and outdoors.
I have
it's all about outdoors. Or a hunting guide.
I have
Sometimes
three, but two of them are kind of similar to what I do. So I will go with, I love music.
Okay.
And if I could be in a blues or jazz band, I'd be in a band.
Okay. Now, do you play in it? I don't know that.
Well, I play, but haven't had enough time to play trumpet and sing. So I would have been a jazz trumpet player, or if I had time to invest in that right now. So
that's awesome.
That's something I always thought maybe I'll do that someday, but it never has happened.
Maybe you should.
I love that.
Maybe that's in your future.
I said yes to the elder chairman
for
a while instead. So that kind of...
Are we working you too much?
It's taking up your time. Okay. Well, thanks you again, guys, for just being a part of this time. Kevin, thanks for your leadership in our organization. Yes. We are so grateful for that and for being a part of this with us today. So again, you'll find links in the show notes to resources we've mentioned today, and as well as just lots of other great resources on the podcast. So thanks so much for joining us today on the theFormed.life podcast.